Thoughts after a sort of precursory look through. I didn't read the whole thing. After I read the introduction, I was pretty much um, so disinterested. I couldn't take the rest of it very seriously, except that I don't know. Some of the rhetoric is interesting. The use of phantasm for a kind of world force, something like Dugan's pneumomachia, um, although she claims to have some particular sense that she uses the word, and I'd simply derived a word from the inferred it from the way she was using it in the introduction and other occasions. The book Who's Afraid of Gender? So I'm not going to critique sort of the content really, because they didn't. Neither did I make a particularly close reading, or did I look at the whole book. But only the general thrust. Of course, I guess I'll say in advance, the last time I saw Judith Butler was on the day Trump won the election, most recently, and the time Trump won the first election, though he lost by 3 million votes, but because of the Electoral College, I had seen Robert Reich in the morning, which is very rare. So, for whatever that's worth, it's sort of strange. In years past, I'd often rub shoulders with her in lectures when she gives. She used to be the head of the rhetoric department, and then she'd host the lectures, and then she'd be there to push some kind of non-entity forward and say, "Oh, this person's written a book. Let's get them to give a lecture on Heidegger that's totally uninteresting and an uninspired speech at that." But so this book has convinced me that it's worth making this recording just for the following reason: to juxtapose her view with that of Isaiah Berlin. So that's the substance of this whole thing. Isaiah Berlin says there's such a thing as authoritarian liberalism. And Catholicism, for instance, is a form of authoritarianism by the Isaiah Berlin's view of liberalism, where I suppose it's a very long question of what liberalism is. Do we look at the actual political movements? Do we look at all the theoretical statements? Samuel Moyn has done a lot of interesting history on that. Do we look at what the most outstanding thinkers like Leo Strauss think liberalism is? In my opinion, Strauss gives numerous different versions of liberalism, because sometimes he gives liberalism out of Locke, as Dugan does, but other times he gives liberalism out of these first statements that sort of make cosmopolitanism possible as a phantasm. So like the Kant's, I think it's Voss's Aufklärung, what is enlightenment, and Hegel's final lectures on the philosophy of history, which basically put the whole world into one picture. Prior to that, you couldn't have cosmopolitan. So we're talking like 1800 and late 1820s, and then Haeckel dies 1831, and then the rest of the 19th century is this build-up into the cosmopolitan thing, and then the supposed defeat of cosmopolitanism, understood just as the, to sort of retroactively name it with Kochev's phrase, it's the homogeneous state, free and homogeneous state. One way to put it, I think, sort of in keeping with Isaiah Berlin's way of dealing with it, is to say natural right is to be, and so Richard Epstein says something different, but I would say natural right, he says natural right is derived from natural law, but I think another way to put it is natural right is what you're free to do, whereas natural law is what you're obliged not to do. So there's somewhere in Dostoevsky's writer's notebooks, he's in this period of the sort of second half of the 19th century on a train somewhere going in the direction of Berlin, I think. He overhears this discussion of two gentlemen, and their contention is whether whether law tells you what you can do or tells you what you can't do. Whether it forbids or commands forbidding could be kind of commanding, but I think the notion of right is basically one half of law, and then basically one version of liberalism is to say we're putting the emphasis on right, which then gets interpreted, I suppose, as freedom, and not just by the jurist, but also by he who made his development in public, as it were, by Schelling, who finally came to his position, as Heidegger says in his freedom essay, but which then was the pinnacle of German idealism, according to Heidegger. So Isaiah Berlin's version is this type of regime can become authoritarian. So what I want to say is, vis-a-vis Isaiah Berlin, we could see Judith Butler as a self-deceiving proselytizer of this thing that she and some people like, but not everybody likes it, obviously. As she says, Maloney in Italy doesn't like it. Italians tend to be more favorable towards Dugin's views. And yeah, if you're pushing something that appeals to some group but not to everybody, then you're not promoting a cosmopolitan universalism in the type that got sort of discredited by the standard view and through the Dreyfus affair, because Dreyfus was a Jew, and then they were told Jews have equal opportunity in the French military and in all public services, but he didn't. He was blamed for something that some Frenchmen had done with regard to espionage with the I don't remember if it was with the Russians or with the Germans, but so we're talking about around the time of the Franco-Prussian War. Dreyfus affair is considerably after the Franco-Prussian War, but I was just thinking maybe it had to do with the fact that we're in a isn't that even compounds the problem. We're dealing with the time of war, and we're also not correctly assigning the person that's doing espionage because of viciousness towards Jews, or because I guess that's the wrong way to. I wouldn't put. I think more sensible is to say why did Dreyfus get blamed? Because Jews were second-class citizens, and it's easier to blame a second-class citizen. It's easier to put the blame on somebody it's harder for them to stand up for themselves. As a guy like Freud made a big point of saying, I'm gonna all this Judenhass or Jew baiting or anything like that, I'm just going to sort of hi-hat it in a way. That was the conditions in those days, I think. But yeah, anytime you have somebody it's easier to put the blame on. That's what sociopaths do. And the cosmopolitan liberalism claimed to be able to cure that, but it couldn't cure it. And in addition, it has the view of the sort of freedom from interference view, but always it becomes meaningless because it's contrasted with the harm principle, or for instance, like in the case of you're free to smoke cigarettes, except that people will start complaining about secondhand smoke, right? You're free to do various things, but if people start complaining about it, then you're no longer free to do it. I have here the old, this building used to be called Bolt Hall. Now it's just called the Berkeley Law Building, because people complained that I guess Bolt was put down as a racist. But I guess more interesting than there's a Cardoza, which is very sort of florid prose. But the Holmes quote over here is probably more interesting. And Holmes is more sort of in the mix of that time when when the cosmopolitan liberalism, which claimed to be universal, was breaking down into the historicism. And Holmes was definitely a historicist, because if you just look at his work on the common law, then you see what he says. He says these principles change out from under us. We have something's written in the books, but then the emotions of men, the conditions of men change, and we no longer even can understand the archaic law of the Greeks, because their idea that if a wagon hit them, not for reasons of financial being made whole again, but for reasons that they should have say over what happens to that wagon. The wagon is given to them, and then, say the wagon actually cripples them or something, then they have the right to strand the wagon out in the middle of a wasteland somewhere in a desolate area and make it suffer, something like that, which makes, generally speaking, makes no sense to anyone today, but which had a certain sense in archaic places around the Mediterranean. So there's all these reasons for the breakdown of liberalism understood as cosmopolitanism, but the end point is you get into this situation where if you accept something like fact-value distinction, then you have to go over like Schmitt to existentialism, which means you simply say there's a group like the Germans, and then there's some other people that are Fremde, as Simmel puts it, strangers, or in Mutatis Mutandis, in Schmitt, he changes everything in Simmel without crediting him, but it's obvious it comes from Simmel, and he changes the stranger into the enemy. But the enemy isn't, enemy is conceived totally in an existentialist way. It's conceived in order to say, just like Butler is talking about the phantasm, this Simmel has already shown this in the figure of the Fremde, which is also the figure of the immigrant, which is also the figure of the itinerant worker, which is also the figure of course, in of Simmel himself. As Simmel didn't think of himself as a stranger because he's a university professor, and even though he's a Jew, he was integrated into the um, I guess into the sort of Prussian thing. And yeah, he died long before the rise of the Nazis. Somewhere off in the Black Forest thinking about philosophy, even though he's famous for sociology. And these ideas that Schmidt developed in a different way, sort of Entwicklungsfähigkeit, found the capacity to develop them in a different way. I shouldn't have put Schmidt down so much as a derivative. He worked things. He has his own version and connects things in his own way. But he's certain. But if existentialism means the following, Simmel has worked out the fact-value distinction in connection to the so-called wertfreie Wissenschaft. And so then one could read. I mean, the leading text on that is his Introduction to the Moral Sciences, written around 1900, Anleitung to the Moral Wissenschaft. But there's another account, which may be more useful, written in the New School in the World War II era, by Arnold Brecht. Arnold Brecht, who was a German jurist, and who was a colleague of Leo Strauss at the New School. It's called something like The Theory of Political Science, or something like that, which, according to the introduction of the book, it's like nobody had really written this type of theory books in the 40s before. That was also the time when Popper came out with his book on free open society and the enemy, which was basically at the time when cosmopolitanism was totally dead. But of course, Popper included the word and its enemies, which is interesting, as Dugan brings out. But then seen in this light, in existentialist light, so Butler calls herself a nominalist, and she has this sort of typical middle-class Jewish view sort of things, and as Zizek has brought out. I mean, there's this view of sort of like, yeah, there's Hashem, but you don't talk about that, so it's fine. You can be a nominalist, and then you can talk about Levinas, and have in the background of your this sort of unspoken, profound, rooted moral sort of superiority, just hidden in your background as a magic force. That's how it comes off. And I think if you talk to somebody like Avital Ronell, then you get a sort of more honest version of it, and you get of course, in an earlier generation. I mean, Sontag is sort of somehow a place in that this from an earlier generation. It's sort of a degeneration from, I mean, I guess you could see degeneration and Ardung from Arendt to Sontag to Butler, Wendy Brown, Ronell, and so on. Because Butler and Wendy Brown connected sort of in a way to Soros and probably partially get some funding by connections in some way. But in any way, I bring that up mainly because of the tact of their view. Like Soros still pushes like some kind of fake cosmopolitan view, as though he could simply impose the morals that he likes, the existential values, if you like, that he likes. I mean, there's a question of whether they're going to put it in terms of fact values, in terms. It's questionable with Butler. She talks all the time about norms. That's her favorite thing. But it's also always questionable whether, like, she's saying right now the way people talk is in terms of norms, but I, Judith Butler, maybe that's not my ultimate take on it, or our view on it. But she talks about norms a lot, which is under the sort of protection of the fact that that's what's done in the university in the last in the last number of decades, norms versus facts, rather than facts versus values, linking to the Werkfrei Wissenschaft. But you could say in Schmidt, the fiend or enemy, rather than the Fremde, what is basically, it's thematized, it's the same thing, thematized a little bit different, is not a value concept, and neither is it a monster of some kind. Rather, it's the existential foe. It's a threat to the existence of a certain group. But likewise, the self-deception of Butler is she doesn't realize she's protecting us as I mean, maybe maybe she would say that she does, but the whole book reads as though she doesn't. She keeps talking as though she's presenting a universally good teaching for the universally good to teach people's children gender. And then there's this phantasm opposing it, this evil specter opposing it, which needs to be sort of brought to the light. We need to exercise analysis on this phantasm of right-wing authoritarianism, ignoring that she's an authoritarian herself, ignoring that there's more. I mean, just thinking of the naming of this school, ignoring that there's more power for her brand of authoritarianism than there is for the others. And even if you don't put it in those, and that Isaiah Berlin, has, being of an older generation, less degenerated, was able to simply admit that. He said, yes, I'm for this type of thing, this type of open society or whatever, but I don't say that I can blame a whole group, so Russians, for instance, or play this game, oh, we're just blaming Putin. The Russians are okay, well, we're blaming Putin. Even though the Russians themselves likes Putin, right? Or somebody more tough than Putin. Putin's sort of a sappy guy in a lot of ways. I mean, why didn't he just knock out all the power plants in Ukraine and then cripple Ukraine? Because he wants to negotiate with the West. He wants to keep this open. He thinks he can eventually strike a deal like he was with George Bush Jr., George W. Get along with the West. He wants to prolong it because he thought he could make a deal with the post-cosmopolitan West, with the commercial West. That's obviously no longer possible. And so I think I'll just end this by saying the self-deceptive Butler view, which still pretends to be a universalist project, whether or not it's of some interest whether she says that positively, but that's the thrust of it. That's what you infer from reading her recent the introduction to her recent book, and reading and listening to her talk about it, the way she talks about her enemies, basically, about the phantasm, and the way she says, oh, I, Judith Butler, am regarded as trafficking with the devil, trafficking with Satan, because basically on the idea that she's a pedophile because she's wants to put into schools in other countries, other cultures, the gender teaching, the teaching of gender, rather than the teaching they currently teach their children. And the whole, what you infer from this is, oh, these people are crazy. How can they accuse me, Judith Butler, of being the devil? It's obviously that they're just doing that because self-interested people like Maloney or like other um, those French sort of uh, um, um, far right-wing so-called politicians are out to swindle the public and to prevent the things that are genuinely good from coming to power. But are they genuinely good, or is it just that you like it because that's the type of stuff that you like? Of course you like it. That's it. It helps you. That's what you're used to. You live in California. Um, I mean, I don't have a problem with it either, per se, but I don't want to impose it on everybody else, and neither do I think it makes any sense to impose it on anyone else. I think Isaiah Berlin's, but the problem is there's kind of no containing it because it's everything is more rapid. Everybody hears about everything. The danger of being contaminated by the so-called phantasm is omnipresent. The speed of the world connection is as Heidegger's so oft thematized and long before the time of social media, is ever increasing, ever accelerating. So that one can't ignore both that Dugin's solution, it's hard to see that it could work, multipolarism, because everything is too connected. But also the sinister pretense that one culture or one Dasein type is the universal type and should be promulgated everywhere, certainly does have a. I mean, why is that wrong for people to present that as as satanic and demonic? It certainly is from their for them. I wouldn't even say. I mean, in a certain way, existentialism goes with perspectivalism type of view. Okay, but I'm going on and on this a bit without achieving more depth. But I just wanted to sort of give expression to that. And again, I think there's a neat juxtaposition between Isaiah Berlin, who says, I'll fight for my way of life, but I can't possibly blame whole societies and think all societies are wrong about their way of life, in contradistinction to Judith Butler, who always tacitly thinks, oh, I'm so virtuous, how can people regard me as trafficking with the devil?